The early morning of October 25th, 1944. 3 o'clock hours. The Surigao Strait, Philippines. The night is pitch black. There is no moon. Heavy tropical rain squalls sweep across the narrow channel of water, reducing visibility to almost zero. Admiral Nishimura stands on the bridge of the battleship Yamashiro. He is leading the Japanese Southern Force, 2 battleships, a heavy cruiser, and 4 destroyers, on a desperate mission to break through into Leyte Gulf and destroy the American invasion fleet. Nishimura is worried about many things: fuel shortages, American submarines, air attacks at dawn. But he is not worried about the darkness. In fact, he welcomes it. For 40 years, the Imperial Japanese Navy has trained obsessively for night combat. While Western navies slept, Japanese crews drilled in the dark, using massive optical binoculars and relying on the superior night vision of their lookouts. Their doctrine, Yazan, night battle, dictates that they will use the cover of darkness to close the range, unleash their devastating long-lance torpedoes, and crush the enemy before the Americans even know they are there. Nishimura scans the horizon with his heavy optics. He sees nothing but black water and rain. He believes his cloak of invisibility is intact. He assumes that if he cannot see the Americans cannot see him. He is dead wrong. 12 miles away, sitting silently in the dark across the exit of the strait, is the ultimate nightmare of the Japanese Navy. 6 American battleships are waiting in a perfect line, crossing the T of the Japanese formation. But these are not just any battleships. 5 of them, the West Virginia, Maryland, Tennessee, California, and Pennsylvania, are the ghosts of Pearl Harbor. They were the ships sunk or damaged in the mud on December 7, 1941. The Japanese thought they were destroyed. Instead, they were raised, rebuilt, and packed with technology that didn't exist when the war started. On the bridge of the USS West Virginia, there are no lookouts squinting into the rain. The gunnery officer is looking at a glowing green screen. The Mark 8 fire control radar has locked onto the Yamashiro. The computer is calculating the range, the bearing, the speed, and even the rotation of the Earth. The guns are already moving, tracking the invisible enemy in the dark. The Japanese are sailing into a technological slaughterhouse, and they don't even know the doors have closed behind them. To understand the magnitude of the shock that was about to hit Admiral Nishimura, we must understand the Japanese obsession with night fighting. After the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 limited the number of capital ships Japan could build, their strategists realized they could never win a sheer numbers game against the United States. If they fought a daylight gunnery duel, the larger American fleet would eventually win. So, Japan decided to own the night. They developed the finest optics in the world: huge, stabilized binoculars that could gather starlight better than the human eye. They selected lookouts with exceptional night vision and trained them with a brutality that Western navies found incomprehensible. They developed flashless powder, so their guns wouldn't give away their position. They built the Type 93 long-lance torpedo, an oxygen-fueled weapon that left no wake and could travel 20 miles. Their plan was always the same: wait for nightfall. Neutralize the American air power. Use superior optics to spot the Americans first. Launch a massive torpedo strike from the darkness. Then turn on the searchlights and finish the confused enemy with gunfire. It had worked brilliantly in the early war. At the Battle of Salvo Island in 1942, a Japanese night attack annihilated 4 Allied heavy cruisers in minutes. They had proven that in the dark, skill and training beat size and numbers. But by 1944, the game had changed. The Japanese were still fighting with eyes and binoculars. The Americans were fighting with electrons. The U.S. Navy had poured billions of dollars into radar development. The result was the Mark 8 fire control radar. This wasn't a search radar that just showed blobs. This was a precision instrument. It could detect the splash of a shell hitting the water 15 miles away. It allowed a ship to fire over the horizon, in total darkness, with greater accuracy than a Japanese ship could fire at noon on a sunny day. The Japanese doctrine of Yazan relied on an assumption that was no longer true: that darkness applied equally to both sides. The composition of the American battle line at Surigao Strait adds a layer of poetic justice that is almost unmatched in military history. On December 7, 1941, the USS West Virginia took 7 torpedo hits and 2 bomb hits at Pearl Harbor. She settled into the mud, her port side ripped open, burning uncontrollably. The Japanese pilots who bombed her believed she was finished. The USS California and USS Tennessee were similarly ravaged. But the American industrial machine did not accept defeat. These ships were refloated, patched, and sent to the Puget Sound Navy Yard. There, they were stripped down to their skeletons. They were widened to improve stability. Their old cage masts were torn down and replaced with modern superstructures. And most importantly, they were wired. Miles of cabling were run through the ships to connect the new 16-inch gun turrets to the advanced radar plotting rooms deep inside the armored citadel. When the West Virginia emerged from the shipyard in 1944, she looked nothing like the ship that died at Pearl Harbor. She was a squat, bristling fortress of antennas and guns. The crew called her the WV. She was slow, she was old, but she carried the most advanced fire control system on the planet. Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf, commanding the American ambush force, deliberately placed these resurrected battleships in the center of his line. He knew the symbolism. He was giving the ghosts the first shot. The ships were hungry for revenge. Many of the crewmen on board had been there at Pearl Harbor. They remembered the humiliation, the fire, and the defeat. Now they were sitting in the dark, watching the radar blips of the Japanese fleet crawl closer, holding their fingers on the triggers of the biggest guns in the Navy. It was a setup that a fiction writer would reject as too perfect, but history arranged it anyway. Admiral Oldendorf had achieved the holy grail of naval tactics, crossing the T. This geometric advantage is simple but devastating. Imagine the Japanese fleet as the vertical line of a T, sailing upwards. Imagine the American fleet as the horizontal top bar of the T. The Japanese ships, sailing in a column, can only fire their forward guns at the enemy. Their rear turrets are blocked by their own superstructures. If the Yamashiro wants to fire, it can only use 2 of its 6 turrets. Furthermore, the ships behind the Yamashiro cannot fire at all without hitting their own leader. The Americans, sailing across the top of the T, can bring every single gun to bear. All their turrets can rotate to the side, the broadside, and fire simultaneously. It is the maximum concentration of firepower against the minimum ability to reply. Oldendorf had positioned his 6 battleships across the mouth of the strait. On his flanks, he placed his cruisers and destroyers. He had created a kill box. The geography of the Surigao Strait forced the Japanese to sail through a narrow channel, meaning they couldn't maneuver, they couldn't spread out, and they couldn't escape. They had to sail straight into the wall of American steel. As Nishimura's force steamed north at 20 knots, they were first harassed by American PT boats and destroyers. These attacks whittled down the Japanese screen, sinking the battleship Fuso, the sister ship of the Yamashiro, with torpedoes before it even reached the main battle line. By the time Nishimura reached the end of the strait, he was alone with the Yamashiro, 1 heavy cruiser, Mogami, and 1 destroyer, Shigure. He didn't know the Fuso was gone. He didn't know the Americans were waiting. He was sailing blind into a trap that had already sprung. At 3:51, the range was 22,800 yards, roughly 13 miles. The radar operator on the USS West Virginia watched the blip of the Yamashiro stabilize on his screen. The solution lights on the fire control computer turned green. Target locked. The gunnery officer keyed his microphone. Open fire. The West Virginia shuddered as 8 16-inch guns fired simultaneously. The muzzle flashes were blinding, lighting up the night like a lightning strike. 8 projectiles, each weighing 2,000 pounds, the weight of a Volkswagen Beetle, hurtled through the black sky at supersonic speeds. Usually in naval warfare, the first salvo is a guess. You fire, you watch the splash, you adjust. But the West Virginia wasn't guessing. The radar data was perfect. At 3:52, roughly 60 seconds after firing, the shells arrived. Japanese lookouts on the Yamashiro might have heard the freight train roar of the incoming ordnance a split second before impact. The first salvo was a direct hit. The shells smashed into the Yamashiro's bridge and superstructure. They didn't just hit, they obliterated the command center. Admiral Nishimura, standing on the bridge, likely died in that first second. The American radar had calculated the solution so precisely that they landed a knockout punch from 13 miles away in total darkness on the very first try. Following the West Virginia, the USS Tennessee and USS California opened fire. Their radar systems were identical. The sky filled with the red-hot arcs of 16-inch and 14-inch tracers. To the Japanese sailors on the deck of the Yamashiro, it must have seemed like the wrath of God. They couldn't see the ships shooting at them. They could only see the muzzle flashes on the horizon, blinking like distant strobes, followed by the terrifying arrival of tons of explosives. The Yamashiro was engulfed in fire. Turrets were blown off their mountings. The pagoda mast collapsed. But the Japanese ship refused to stop. Its guns fired back wildly at the muzzle flashes, but without radar, they were shooting at ghosts. The shells landed harmlessly in the water, miles from the American line. The era of optical rangefinding was over. By 4 o'clock, the Surigao Strait had turned into a corridor of fire. The Yamashiro, once the pride of the Imperial fleet, was now a drifting wreck. She had been hit by dozens of heavy-caliber shells. Her decks were a twisted landscape of burning steel. But she was not sinking, not yet. In a display of suicidal bravery that commanded the respect of even the American sailors watching through their rangefinders, the burning battleship continued to return fire. But the Japanese return fire was erratic. Without radar fire control, they were aiming at the muzzle flashes of the American line. By the time their shells arrived at the American position, the U.S. ships had already moved slightly, or the range estimation was off by a few hundred yards. The American ships were untouched. The USS West Virginia and California continued to pour fire into the Yamashiro with the rhythmic precision of a factory assembly line. Load. Aim. Fire. Reload. The radar computers adjusted the aim automatically for the target's slowing speed. The American cruisers on the flanks joined the execution. They fired over 3,000 rounds of 6-inch and 8-inch ammunition in 20 minutes. The volume of fire was so intense that the tracers formed a solid arch of light over the strait. American sailors on the destroyers described it as looking like a red-hot ceiling or a continuous stream of lava. Admiral Nishimura, if he was still alive in the wreckage of the bridge, would have realized the magnitude of his failure. He had brought a knife to a gunfight, and the gunfight was taking place in a pitch-black room where his enemy was wearing night vision goggles. At 4:19, the Yamashiro, broken and burning from stem to stern, capsized and sank. She took almost her entire crew of 1,600 men with her. There were only 10 survivors. The ghost ships of Pearl Harbor had exacted their revenge. Behind the dying Yamashiro, the heavy cruiser Mogami was trapped in the same hell. The Mogami was a legendary ship in the Japanese Navy, a survivor of Midway and multiple Solomon Island battles. But here she was helpless. A salvo of 8-inch shells from the American cruisers smashed into her bridge, killing all the senior officers. The ship was leaderless, burning, and sailing in circles in the dark. In the confusion, the Mogami attempted to retreat south. But in the blindness of the smoke and rain, she collided with the Japanese heavy cruiser Nachi, part of a second, smaller Japanese force that was following Nishimura. The collision was the final insult. It slowed the Mogami to a crawl, making her an easy target for American destroyers and later the next morning, American aircraft. The retreat of the Japanese survivors was a scene of utter chaos. They had entered the strait expecting a decisive battle, a glorious night engagement where their superior spirit and optical training would crush the Americans. They left as a broken remnant, fleeing from an enemy they couldn't see, hit by shells that seemed to come from nowhere. The American destroyers, emboldened by the carnage, darted in to finish off the cripples with torpedoes. The Yazan doctrine, the decades of training, the night-fighting cult, it all evaporated in the face of the Mark 8 radar. As dawn broke over the Philippines on October 25th, the squalls lifted. The surface of the Surigao Strait was calm. The deafening roar of the 16-inch guns was replaced by an eerie silence. The water was thick with oil, debris, and the few survivors clinging to wreckage. The American battleships steamed slowly through the area, their crews coming out onto the decks to look at the result of their handiwork. For the sailors on the West Virginia, California, and Tennessee, the morning light brought a profound sense of closure. 3 years earlier, many of them had been swimming in the burning oil of Pearl Harbor, watching their ships settle into the mud, listening to the screams of their shipmates. They had spent years training, rebuilding, and waiting for this moment. They had not just defeated the enemy, they had annihilated him. The victory was so complete that the American battleships suffered virtually no damage. The West Virginia fired 93 rounds of 16-inch armor-piercing shells. She was not hit once. The disparity in casualties was staggering. The Japanese lost thousands of men. The Americans lost only a few dozen, mostly on the PT boats and destroyers that had engaged at close range. It was the most lopsided surface naval victory of the war. The Battle of Surigao Strait holds a unique place in history. It was the last time battleships fought battleships. For centuries, the line of battle was the ultimate expression of naval power. From the wooden ships of Trafalgar to the steel dreadnoughts of Jutland, naval warfare was decided by big guns firing at other big ships. Surigao Strait was the final chapter of that book. It was fitting that the last duel was fought by the old guard, battleships raised from the dead, rather than the new, fast battleships like the Iowa or New Jersey. The Iowa-class ships were off chasing carriers with Admiral Halsey. The old battleships, too slow to keep up with the carriers, were left to guard the gate. And when the enemy came, they proved that the big gun was still the deadliest weapon on the sea if you could hit the target. But the battle also proved that the era was over. The Japanese battleships didn't lose because their armor was weak or their guns were small. They lost because they couldn't see. Technology, specifically radar and fire control computers, had rendered the romance of visual combat obsolete. The Japanese reliance on spirit and eyesight was no match for the cold, hard data of a radar plot. After this battle, the battleship would retire to a supporting role, bombarding shorelines and acting as a floating anti-aircraft battery. The Queens of the Ocean had fired their last great salvo. The story of Surigao Strait is the ultimate industrial flex. The United States didn't just outproduce Japan, it out-innovated them. When the West Virginia was sunk at Pearl Harbor, the Japanese assumed it was a total loss because, for them, a ship like that would take years to replace. The U.S. Navy not only repaired it, they upgraded it. They turned a 1920s relic into a 1940s cyborg ship, packed with electronics that the Japanese could barely comprehend. Admiral Nishimura sailed into that strait believing in the superiority of the Japanese warrior spirit. He believed that night and rain were his allies. He died discovering that technology does not care about spirit. Radar does not care about darkness. The Mark 8 fire control computer didn't hate the Japanese. It simply calculated their coordinates and removed them from existence. The legacy of the battle is a lesson in technological adaptation. Japan spent the war trying to perfect the tactics of the past: better binoculars, better night lookouts, better torpedoes. The United States spent the war inventing the tactics of the future: radar, computers, integrated fire control. One approach relied on human limitation, the other transcended it. When you look at the photo of the USS West Virginia entering Tokyo Bay for the surrender ceremony in 1945, remember Surigao Strait. That ship, which had burned in the mud of Pearl Harbor, was there to watch the empire that sank her sign its final capitulation. She was a ghost that came back to haunt her killers, armed with the power of American industry and the unblinking eye of the radar screen. It was the night the lights went out for the Imperial Japanese Navy, and the ghosts of Pearl Harbor were the ones who flipped the switch.